I saw Jacob lifted off the ground by something nearly 3 meters tall and dragged into the forest. The sound of his body striking the ferns, branches snapping, and my own ragged breathing blended into chaos. The camera on my chest was still recording, but all I could see was a black, fur-covered shadow rushing past the fir trunks. I shouted into the radio and received nothing but static. Then the ground beneath my feet trembled. From the direction of the logging site, a terrifyingly deep explosion rolled through the forest. At that moment, I understood that the creature was not running away from me. It was running ahead of something even more frightening. Hello, I'm Victor, and welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. Today's story takes us to Oregon, where a ranger claimed he recorded Bigfoot dragging a logging worker away from the site moments before disaster struck. The case file was compiled by our editorial team from witness accounts, forums, blogs, documents, and the Bigfoot research community. We cannot verify whether this was a real event, an exaggerated story, or a modern legend. So please listen with an open mind. If you believe ancient forests still hide unexplained secrets, comment Bigfoot or believe, or share your own experience. And now, here is the story of Ethan Brooks. On the morning of October 3, 2023, Ethan Brooks had just returned to the ranger station near Gold Beach after inspecting a trail when Linda Carver called him into her office. On the old wooden desk in front of her lay 6 reports from the same logging site deep on the western slope of the Siskiyou Mountains. Ethan pulled out a chair, removed his still damp gloves, and turned through the pages with the calm expression of someone accustomed to dealing with exaggerated stories after long nights in the woods. The first report mentioned a generator weighing nearly 200 kilograms that had been dragged more than 10 meters from its shed. The second described 2 fuel drums placed neatly in the middle of the haul road. Tree-marking ribbons had also been removed and tied to branches far beyond the workers' reach. What kept the room silent longer was the account of 3 deep knocks coming from the forest, followed by a similar sequence answering from the opposite mountainside. Marcus Reed stood beside the filing cabinet with his arms folded and said, "No one on the logging crew wanted to sign their name beneath the description of a human-like creature." Ethan studied a photograph of a handprint pressed into mud. Rain had blurred the edges, but it was still nearly twice the size of an adult hand. He set the photograph down and said black bears, strong winds, equipment sliding over wet ground, or an internal prank could all create stories like these. Linda listened and then pushed the map toward him. The repeated reports had distracted the workers, slowed progress, and caused several men to refuse night shifts. She needed a clear assessment before fear turned into a real accident. Ethan agreed to conduct a 3-day patrol and suggested wearing a body camera to record the entire process. As he stood, Marcus lowered his voice and added that 2 weeks earlier, a truck driver had quit after seeing a figure standing in the road at 3 in the morning. The driver insisted the creature had been taller than the roof of his cab when the headlights shone directly on it. Ethan gave a faint smile, rolled up the map, and stepped into the hallway. Before leaving the room, however, he looked once more at the coordinates of Black Fern Ridge, which bordered a mountainside area that had once been closed because of unstable ground. That detail kept Linda's eyes on the map a little longer, because the logging site sat directly below a geological zone where small slides had occurred after seasons of heavy rain. Ethan Brooks' pickup left the paved road and moved deeper into Black Fern Ridge, where the logging track narrowed between a damp earthen wall on one side and a steep slope of Douglas fir on the other. Tire ruts still held water, although the latest rain had ended 2 days earlier, and thin streams continued seeping from the mountainside, carrying gray mud toward the road's edge. Ethan slowed whenever the tires slipped across loose stones and noted tree trunks with exposed roots, as though the soil around them had been pulled away. When he reached the site, the roar of tractors and chainsaws filled the clearing. Dale Hargrove, the foreman, approached with guarded impatience. Dale said the rumors were distracting the crew, slowing production, and threatening the logging contract. He wanted Ethan to make a quick inspection and declare the site safe. Ethan refused to reach a conclusion yet and asked who had seen the clearest evidence. Jacob Miller, standing near the cable yarder, removed his gloves and came over. He explained that the equipment had been moved in a particular direction. The generator, fuel drums, and tools had all been dragged away from the strip of ground at the foot of the slope, creating an open space that looked more like an escape corridor than vandalism. Luis Ortega led Ethan to a marked fir tree. 4 clear scratches cut through the bark at a height of more than 3 meters. Ethan measured the distance between the marks. They were wider than normal bear claw marks, although he explained that a bear standing on a fallen stump might leave scratches that high. Ben Carter laughed and accused Luis of making the marks with a cable hook. Luis stepped forward with his jaw clenched, and Jacob moved between them before a fight could begin. Ethan realized that fear had divided the crew into 2 sides, those who wanted to leave and those who dismissed everything as superstition. He inspected the base of the slope and found thin cracks in the soil, wide enough for the tip of a pencil. Dale insisted the company engineer had evaluated the area and approved continued work. Ethan requested that heavy machinery be limited until an additional inspection could be made, but Dale refused to stop production without a direct order. After Dale walked away, Jacob quietly explained that the knocking in the woods appeared before every incident in which equipment was moved. The previous night, the sequence had begun after a loud fall of rock from the slope. Ethan had just started his camera to record the statement when 3 deep knocks sounded from the tree line. 5 seconds later, 3 more answered from higher on the mountain. The entire site fell silent, and Dale immediately ordered the machinery started again. Beneath the engines growing louder, Ethan kept watching the slope where several small stones were slowly rolling down. As the last daylight withdrew from Blackfern Ridge, Ethan Brooks left the logging site and drove to an old service cabin nearly a mile away. The small wooden building had not been used regularly for years, but its roof was sound, the stove still worked, and a table beside the window gave him enough space to spread out his map, radio, and recording equipment. Before darkness fully settled, Ethan placed 2 motion-activated cameras along the dirt road, one aimed toward the mountainside and the other toward the cabin entrance. He checked the batteries, recorded the time, and marked the locations in his notebook. Jacob Miller stopped by just as Ethan closed his equipment case. He carried 2 cups of hot coffee and leaned against the porch rail, staring toward the trees sinking into darkness. Jacob said his father had worked in logging for nearly 30 years and had always believed the forest gave warnings before an accident. Birds changed their flight paths, water seeped from slopes, roots lifted from the ground, and the woodland gradually fell quiet. For the past 3 afternoons, Jacob had noticed the birds vanishing at almost exactly the same time. Ethan listened carefully, but still believed the silence could be caused by machinery and logging activity. Jacob did not argue. He only said Blackfern Ridge felt like the days when his father would order the entire crew to stop even before any official forecast issued a warning. Near 11 that night, Ethan awoke to the slow scrape of metal over gravel. He switched on his body camera, took a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The toolbox that had been beside the cabin wall was now lying in the middle of the road, nearly 8 meters from its original position. 2 clear drag marks crossed the gravel, but there were no tire tracks around them. Ethan's beam stopped on 2 fresh branches laid across each other in the shape of an X. Each was nearly as thick as his wrist, and the broken ends were still wet with sap. Nearby, a long depression marked the mud. Water had blurred its edge, but its width far exceeded the sole of his boot. A deep, steady, heavy breathing sounded from beyond the trees. Ethan raised the flashlight, identified himself as a ranger, and ordered whoever was hiding to come out. Shoulder-high brush trembled slightly, and then a small stone landed in front of his boot. Ethan retreated into the cabin and locked the door. When he checked the cameras, he discovered that one remained intact, but had been turned to face directly into a tree trunk. In the final audio segment, a low hiss appeared just before 3 knocks answered from somewhere far away. The next morning, Ethan Brooks returned to Blackfern Ridge before the shift began, carrying the camera recording and photographs of the toolbox dragged from the cabin. Dale Hargrove listened to the full account with his arms folded, his eyes resting on the screen for several seconds, before saying that a drunk worker could have turned the camera and arranged a few branches in the road. Ethan kept his voice calm and repeated his request to suspend operations near the foot of the slope until a geologist could inspect it. Dale objected immediately, citing the contract, delivery deadline, and financial penalties if the machine sat idle for even one more day. While the 2 men argued, Jacob Miller inspected the cable system beside a large fir stump. As the cable tightened, small stones rolled from above, struck the machine frame, and fell into the mud. Jacob shut off the engine, climbed from the cab, and stared uphill. Dale signaled for him to continue, insisting that isolated rockfall was normal in the area. Luis Ortega found that the orange ribbons marking the trees scheduled for cutting had been removed. They had been tied around a dead stump near the emergency access road, creating a path leading away from the foot of the mountain. Ben Carter laughed loudly, pulled out his knife, cut down the ribbons one by one, and threw them to the ground while saying someone was turning the site into a cheap performance. As the words left his mouth, a branch nearly 2 meters long flew from the forest and struck the ground, less than an arm's length from his shoulder. Ben stepped back, all mockery gone from his face. Ethan immediately ran into the trees, but beyond the ferns he found only a line of deep depressions. The distance between them was unusually long, like the stride of a body far larger than an adult human. He photographed the marks, recorded the coordinates, and kept his conclusion to himself. Early that afternoon, the satellite phone received a warning of heavy rain moving over the mountains within 2 days. Ethan called the ranger station and requested a geologist, but the nearest specialist could not arrive until the following morning. Dale overheard the conversation and ordered the crew to accelerate production before the bad weather came. Jacob objected, warning that the cable system was transmitting vibration directly into already cracked ground. Dale threatened to replace him if he refused to operate it. Ethan walked to the water seeping from the base of the slope and saw that it had turned cloudy gray. At that moment, a long howl descended from the mountainside. One machine after another shut down, and everyone looked up. A second howl sounded closer, directly above Jacob's position. Behind the firs, a small tree bent violently and sprang back, as though an enormous body had just passed through the shadows. On the 3rd afternoon at Blackfern Ridge, the entire worksite felt oppressive after the howl from the mountainside. Ethan Brooks walked along the logging boundary, watching the cracks around the roots. The crew was preparing to pull a large fir trunk. Jacob Miller left the cable machine's cab to inspect a safety line fastened around a low stump. He bent to release the hook, bracing the cable with his shoulder so it would not slip, while Dale Hargrove pushed everyone to finish the job. A low sound came from inside the mountain, like a massive piece of timber breaking underground. Ethan looked up and saw a narrow strip of soil sliding between exposed roots. He shouted for Jacob to move away from the slope, but the engine noise and clanging metal swallowed the warning. Jacob had only just turned when a black figure appeared between two fir trunks. The creature stepped from the trees on two legs, taller than any man Ethan had ever met, its shoulders almost as wide as the trail, and its entire body covered in black fur mixed with dark brown. Jacob froze for a heartbeat, still gripping the cable hook. The creature rushed forward, wrapped a gigantic arm around his chest, and lifted him from the ground. Jacob screamed, kicked hard, and grabbed the safety line as it drew tight. The metal hook tore free of the stump with a sharp crack. Ethan pulled out his bear spray, but Jacob's body blocked the creature, forcing him to hold back to avoid injuring the worker. He shouted for it to stop, his voice rough amid the machinery shutting down. The creature turned its head and looked at Ethan for a brief moment. Its deep-set eyes beneath a low brow held a strange and deliberate calm. Then it pulled Jacob closer and ran into the forest. Dale yelled for Ethan to use his gun, but the gaps between the trees were too narrow, and Jacob struggled in front of the target. Ethan activated his radio, reported that a worker was being carried away by a large creature, and ran after them. Through the dense ferns, he saw the enormous back moving among the trunks. It traveled on two legs with strides so long Ethan had to sprint just to remain within sight. Jacob continued calling for help, but his voice was gradually overwhelmed by breaking branches and Ethan's heavy breathing. What confused Ethan was that the creature chose open spaces between trees rather than the shortest route. Each time Jacob was about to strike a trunk, it turned its shoulders, shifted its grip, and supported his head with one hand. Ethan interpreted the behavior as the way a predator might keep prey alive, because he had no other explanation. As the distance widened, the creature turned toward the logging site, gave a short roar, and accelerated. Ethan had just crossed beyond the logging boundary when the ground beneath him trembled lightly. Behind him, a deep cloak explosion rose from within the mountain and spread through the forest like thunder trapped underground. The creature heard it and carried Jacob faster, as though every second of delay might allow whatever lay behind them to swallow them both. Ethan followed the movement ahead while holding the radio near his mouth and reporting their direction. Signals from the site came in broken fragments. Dale's voice was torn apart by static, leaving only the words Jacob, East, and creature as the entirety of what the two sides could exchange. The old forest closed quickly behind Ethan. Fir trunks stood close together, waist-high ferns concealed the ground, and raised roots turned every step into a possible fall. Ethan tried to keep his eyes on the giant back between the trees, but the distance constantly changed. At times, the creature vanished behind a cluster of trunks. Seconds later, a large branch breaking or a strip of leaves shaking violently showed him where to continue. It felt as though the creature was running fast enough to escape everyone, while leaving just enough evidence for Ethan to follow. When the slope dropped, Ethan slipped and struck his knee against a moss-covered rock. Pain shot through his leg and stopped his breath, but hearing Jacob call his name from ahead drove him back to his feet. About 50 meters away, the creature paused beside a fallen tree. It shifted Jacob from a horizontal hold against its chest to a diagonal position across its shoulder, using one hand behind his head to protect him from low branches. Jacob continued struggling and reached for the multi-tool attached to his belt. The creature noticed, pulled the knife from his hand, and threw it beside the trail. Its grip remained steady, firm enough to keep Jacob from falling, but not tight enough to stop his breathing. After adjusting its arm for several seconds, it continued forward. Ethan picked up the knife and found the blade clean and the handle undamaged. That detail began to weaken his first conclusion, although the sight of Jacob being carried deeper into the woods still forced him to treat the creature as a threat. He tore red flagging strips from his rescue pack and tied them to low branches for the search team. Watching more closely, Ethan realized the creature was following a consistent elevation, avoiding soft ground, cracked mud, and fields of loose rock that had recently shifted. A loud fall of stone suddenly came from the direction of the site. The creature stopped, listened, and struck a tree trunk twice with its hand. From a more distant slope, 2 deep knocks answered immediately. Ethan tightened his grip on the radio, understanding that the creature ahead might be communicating with another individual while all contact with support had been lost. The slope ahead descended to a fast-moving tributary flowing toward Lobster Creek. Rainwater from the higher mountains still poured through the rock channels, even though the sky had been clear for 2 days. Ethan had just seen the cloudy white water beneath the trees when the enormous creature appeared on the opposite bank. The gap was nearly 8 meters wide, and the current churned around black, moss-covered rocks, strong enough to punish any misplaced step. The creature placed Jacob on a high rock before looking for a route across. Jacob immediately tried to crawl toward the brush, but the safety strap around his ankle caught on an exposed root. As his body slid toward the edge, the creature bent down, seized the strap behind his back, and held him with one arm. Ethan arrived on the opposite bank, breathing hard, his knee aching from the earlier fall. He raised the bear spray, ordered the creature away from Jacob, and stepped onto a rock near the water. The creature looked at him and then repeatedly glanced toward the slope upstream. Jacob shouted that it had not hit him, although his voice still shook from being restrained in such an unfamiliar place. Ethan moved another half step. As his foot reached the edge, the creature gave a short roar. He stopped instinctively. A rotten log swept down from upstream at that exact moment, crashed through the place where he had intended to step, struck the bank, and spun in the current. Ethan backed away, a cold sensation running down his spine, as he realized the roar might have been a warning. The creature waited for the water to ease, lifted Jacob, and crossed in 3 long strides over the exposed rocks. It held Jacob on the upstream side, used its shoulder and back to shield him from floating branches, and lowered one hand to keep his head from striking the stones. Ethan had to travel almost 50 meters farther before finding water shallow enough to cross safely. 10 minutes passed before he reached the other bank. In the wet mud, clear footprints measured nearly 45 centimeters long, with 5 widely spread toes and heels, deeper than any boot mark Ethan had ever seen. Near a patch of ferns, he found Jacob's glove. Inside the palm, written hurriedly with a work marker, were the words, "It hasn't hurt me." Ethan clenched the glove and looked at the nearby tree. A muddy handprint marked the bark, its fingers pointing diagonally toward a ravine ahead, like a crude arrow leading into the dark, dense forest. Behind him, a second explosion rolled from the logging site. Hundreds of birds burst from the area at once, forming a black, swirling mass against the gray sky. At the Black Fern Ridge site, the explosion from the mountainside made everyone look up. But dense brush and the fading machinery noise concealed any clear sign of what had happened. Dale Hargrove held the radio and repeatedly called Ethan Brooks, receiving only broken fragments through static. He heard Jacob's name, the word east, and scattered references to a large creature, then pointed northeast and insisted Ethan had run in that direction. Luis Ortega objected, because he had heard a call echoing from a creek ravine to the southeast. The 2 routes were far enough apart to cost a search team hours if they chose incorrectly. When Linda Carver arrived with 2 rangers and a rescue group, she ordered the workers away from the base of the slope before organizing the search. Dale still wanted men to remain behind and move the tractors, bulldozers, and fuel drums. Linda looked at the widening cracks around the roots and said equipment could be replaced, but people could not. Ben Carter interrupted, arguing that Jacob was being dragged deeper into the forest, and every minute of delay reduced his chance of survival. Linda divided the force into 2 groups. The first followed Ethan's red ribbons, while the second helped evacuate the site and inspect the mountainside. The route markers were initially clear, but high wind had wrapped several ribbons around other branches, while broken limbs covered parts of the trail. After nearly 10 minutes, the search team drifted north. Luis found a large footprint deep in the mud and called everyone back. Dale placed his boot beside it and stepped on the edge, dismissing it as a water-distorted hollow. Luis became furious, but Linda pulled him away and ordered every trace marked. At the same time, deep in the forest, Ethan raised the radio again. Linda's voice unexpectedly broke through the interference for several seconds. He reported that he was following the creek ravine and tried to say the tributary's name, but the signal vanished before he completed the sentence. Back at the site, a worker removing a temporary fence discovered that every metal fastener had been bent from the night before. The fence had blocked the emergency route, and it now stood open as a direct passage toward higher ground. Linda stared at the open path and then at cloudy water leaking from the mountain. A large fir tilted before her eyes, and the soil around its roots swelled into a long ridge. She understood immediately that someone had cleared an evacuation route before the logging crew recognized the danger approaching them. After crossing the stream, Ethan Brooks continued following the large footprints toward higher ground. His injured knee disrupted his pace, and his lungs burned after nearly half an hour of pursuit. The creature appeared and disappeared between fir trunks and thick ferns. At the base of a gray basalt wall, Ethan saw it stop beside a rock hollow deep enough to shelter most of Jacob's body. It placed the worker against the wall, then turned its back to him and watched the direction of the logging site. Jacob lowered his head, breathing hard, one hand holding the shoulder bruised by the safety harness. When he tried to free his ankle from the strap caught around a root, the creature took a small branch and used its tip to lift each loop instead of pulling violently. The movement slowed Ethan's approach. He still held the bear spray, but wind from the hollow blew directly toward him and Jacob, making its use likely to blind both men. Ethan drew his handgun, kept the muzzle pointed downward, and ordered the creature to move away. It turned, revealing its face more clearly than ever before. A low forehead covered in dark hair, a broad nose, brown-gray skin around the mouth, and deep eyes with an alert and intelligent expression. A long scar crossed its left arm, where the fur had grown thin, suggesting an old injury. Jacob spoke before Ethan stepped closer. He explained that the creature had changed its grip repeatedly to keep the harness from tightening around his neck and had stopped for several seconds before every tremor in the ground. Jacob had begun to believe it was carrying him away from the logging site because he had been the person standing closest to the foot of the slope when it appeared. Ethan looked down and realized the route they had followed was not leading deeper into the wilderness. It formed an arc around the mountain, gradually climbing toward high ground, overlooking the entire worksite. A deep vibration traveled through the rock beneath them. The creature immediately rose, pulled Jacob away from the wall, and pressed one hand against the ground. For several seconds, fingers spread over the damp gravel. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. The creature struck the rock face with one palm, sending fragments down between them like a warning boundary. Then it lifted Jacob, turned toward the rising trail, and accelerated. Ethan looked at the thin dust plume beginning to rise above the trees in the direction of the site, and realized the creature was trying to reach a high point before something happened below. He holstered his weapon, picked up Jacob's knife, and followed. For the first time during the pursuit, Ethan felt that his objective had changed. He still had to bring Jacob back. But first he needed to understand what was driving the creature away from the mountain with such urgency. The creature continued carrying Jacob upward along a narrow trail winding through ancient firs, where roots formed natural steps. Ethan followed behind, his knee aching and his throat raw after running for nearly half an hour. The dust above the logging site grew thicker, and cracking sounds inside the mountain came more frequently. Beyond a cluster of basalt rocks, Ethan saw a high outcrop open ahead. The creature stepped onto it, placed Jacob behind a fallen trunk, and stood between him and the slope below. The ground there was solid rock, high above the logging operation, with a clear view of Black Fern Ridge through breaks in the canopy. Ethan arrived almost 2 minutes later, breathing so heavily that he had to brace his hands on his knees. Jacob sat less than 30 meters away, muddy but conscious. He raised a hand to show that he was all right and began crawling toward Ethan. The creature moved sideways, lowered an arm in front of him, and forced him to stop. Ethan raised his gun reflexively, but the creature's gaze was fixed on the rock ahead, causing him to look down. A thin crack ran near the edge, extending across the route Jacob had intended to use. At that moment, a section of rock broke loose and fell into the deep ravine. Ethan lowered the weapon, understanding that the shortest route was also the most dangerous. The creature pulled Jacob several steps farther behind the fallen trunk and then turned its back on both men to watch the logging site. Ethan could no longer easily view it as a predator guarding prey. He switched his body camera to high-quality mode, checked the indicator light, and tried the radio. Only prolonged static filled his earpiece. Through the dust, he saw Linda Carver leading workers toward the emergency road. Another group remained around the tractors and bulldozers, trying to move equipment from the foot of the slope. Dale Hargrove ran between the cabs, waving his arms and urging everyone to continue. Ethan held the radio to his mouth and shouted for them to leave, but the signal remained dead. A sequence of heavy sounds came from the mountainside, roots tearing free, stones striking each other, and tree trunks cracking in waves. The creature lowered its center of gravity, put one hand on Jacob's shoulder, and pulled him deeper behind the fallen trunk. Ethan also stepped back, eyes fixed on the logging site. Trees on the opposite slope began leaning in the same direction. The ground beneath Ethan trembled lightly, then more strongly, like a train passing through the mountain. The creature raised its head and released a long howl toward the worksite. It was the same howl the crew had heard during the previous days, but now Ethan understood its meaning. It was the final warning. A dark fracture appeared across the mountainside, stretching through the trees, and then the entire layer of earth above began to move. Ethan saw Linda turn, Jacob grip the fallen trunk, and the enormous creature lower its body to shield him. In that moment, Ethan's remaining doubts disappeared. Bigfoot had carried Jacob to that place to save his life, and the disaster below had begun. The opposite mountainside began moving like a gigantic body awakening. Fir trees along the upper line leaned downward, slowly enough for Ethan to see the soil bulging around their roots before splitting into long cracks. Then the earth beneath them slid all at once. The sound of roots tearing from the mountain blended with stone striking stone, creating a deep roar that shook Ethan's chest. At the Black Fern Ridge site, Linda Carver led workers toward the emergency route that had already been opened. Some followed, while others still tried to climb into tractor cabs and save equipment. Dale Hargrove ran toward his pickup, reaching through the window for a folder on the seat. Luis Ortega turned just as the ground behind Dale collapsed. He grabbed the foreman by the collar, pulled him away from the truck, and dragged him toward higher ground. Seconds later, an uprooted fir swept across the cab, crushed the roof, and carried the vehicle into the mud. From the outcrop, Ethan saw the cable yarder Jacob Miller had operated tilt as soil and rock struck it. The machine slid sideways, hit a stump, and overturned. The place where Jacob had been standing when the creature appeared vanished beneath brown earth, broken stone, and overlapping trunks. Jacob gripped the fallen tree in front of him, his lips parted but unable to form words. The enormous creature knelt behind him, one arm around his shoulders, its back toward the mountain as it shielded him from flying debris. Ethan crouched behind a fir, covering his head with his elbows, while the body camera continued recording the shaking scene. A piece of bark struck his cheek, leaving a hot sting, but he never looked away from the sight. The slide poured across the brake shelter, carrying fuel drums, cables, and twisted metal before burying everything beneath dense dust. In less than a minute, the clearing that had been filled with machinery became a field of wreckage, stretching to the valley floor. As the movement subsided, Ethan could hear Jacob breathing and small stones continuing to fall below the outcrop. Jacob stared at the place where the cable machine had disappeared, his hands trembling against the bark. He understood that if he had remained there for only a few more minutes, he too would have been buried. Ethan looked at the creature protecting Jacob and remembered the generator dragged away from the slope. The marking ribbons moved toward the escape road, the fence bent open, and the howls that had sounded for 3 days. Events that once seemed unrelated now formed a warning humans had ignored. The creature had finally used force to carry Jacob away because every earlier signal had failed. Dust gradually filled the valley, but Bigfoot did not leave the outcrop. It rose slowly, turned toward the southern forest, and held its entire body tense. A long howl rose from below the valley, then several more answered one after another through the gray dust. Dust from the landslide still covered the valley below, separating the outcrop from the logging site behind a gray curtain. Ethan Brooks moved slowly toward Jacob Miller, keeping both hands visible so the enormous creature would understand that he did not intend to attack. Bigfoot stood several meters away, with its head slightly tilted, its eyes shifting between Ethan and the southern forest where the howls had sounded. Jacob sat against the fallen trunk, one hand holding his shoulder and the other gripping the rough bark as though he needed it to remain calm. When Ethan came close enough, he examined the safety harness tightened across Jacob's chest and shoulder. The outer clothing had been pulled aside, and the skin underneath was bruised. But there were no bites, scratches, or signs that the creature had tried to hurt him. Jacob took a deep breath and explained that throughout the journey from the logging site, Bigfoot had continually changed its grip before the strap could tighten around his neck. Every time he struck a branch or began slipping from its shoulder, the creature stopped, adjusted its arm, and continued. Twice the ground had trembled. Both times it had stood still as though listening to something beneath the soil, then changed direction before stones and branches fell onto the former route. Jacob spoke slowly, his voice hoarse from shouting for so long, but every detail showed Ethan that the creature's behavior had a clear purpose. Jacob had been the only person standing directly at the base of the slope when Bigfoot appeared. The other workers were farther away or protected in machine cabs. The creature had selected the person in the most immediate danger and used its strength to remove him before the mountainside collapsed. Ethan looked at Jacob's ankle and found that the safety line was still wrapped tightly around a root. Bigfoot approached, causing Ethan's hand to move instinctively toward his gun. The creature stopped, looked at his hand, and then at the strap. Ethan slowly stepped aside. Bigfoot bent down and pulled at the metal clasp with its fingers. It tried once, changed the angle, and broke the pin with precisely controlled force. Jacob was freed, and the creature immediately turned toward the howling. It picked up a large branch and held it across its body like a defensive tool. In the mud near the edge of the rock, Ethan saw several fresh wolf tracks overlapping the Bigfoot prints. They extended from the creek ravine all the way to the high outcrop. A gray shadow passed through the dust below, followed by 2 more behind the trees. Jacob had been rescued from the collapsing mountain, But a new danger had followed them to the refuge. The radio on Ethan Brooks' shoulder suddenly burst with static, and Linda Carver's voice came through. She confirmed that the workers had escaped. The slide zone, 2 people were injured, and Luis had pulled Dale Hargrove away from his pickup moments before the mud struck. Ethan leaned close to the radio and reported that Jacob Miller was alive, and that both of them were on a rocky outcrop east of the worksite. Linda ordered them to remain where they were because the route down had been buried, while the rescue team was moving along the western ridge to reach them. As the signal faded, Jacob closed his eyes, slowly exhaled, and rested his head against the fallen tree. During the entire time he had been carried from the site, he had believed he would disappear in the forest and never be found. Hearing Linda's voice alone was enough to relax his shoulders. Ethan took out his rescue whistle and blew 3 long notes toward the ridge. Several seconds later, 3 weaker notes answered from far away. Jacob looked at him with a trace of relief on his dust-covered face. Bigfoot reacted differently. It stepped to the edge of the outcrop, raised its head toward the southern forest, and gave a deep growl. It dragged a rotten trunk sideways and placed it across the narrowest path upward. At first, Ethan thought the creature was trying to prevent the rescuers from approaching. Then the dust below shifted. 3 gray shapes moved among the bushes, traveling low to the ground in a curved route toward the outcrop. Ethan took binoculars from his pack and recognized adult gray wolves, their wet fur clumped, bodies lean, and movements unsteady after the landslide tore apart their territory. Bigfoot dragged more branches into a rough barrier at the easiest approach. Ethan understood then that the creature was protecting them from what was climbing toward them, not keeping them away from humans. Jacob pushed himself upright and suggested moving toward the rescue whistles. But Ethan held his shoulder. The route between them and the western ridge ran through dense woodland where the wolves were spreading out. Linda's voice returned briefly through the radio, then vanished before Ethan could warn her. Below the slope, the number of gray shadows grew from 3 to 6. A larger wolf with a long white scar across its muzzle stepped from the dust and stared directly at Jacob. Bigfoot stood between the worker and the pack, gripping the large branch with both hands and lowering its entire body into a ready stance. Silence covered the outcrop beneath the gray dust. The hope of rescue had barely appeared before a new encirclement closed around them. Bigfoot moved toward the narrowest path onto the outcrop, where 2 rock walls formed a corridor only wide enough for 1 adult animal. It held the large branch across its chest, planted its feet on the wet stone, and struck the end hard against the ground. The dry, heavy sound echoed among the firs and slowed the advancing wolves. The scar-faced leader lowered its head and moved sideways, searching for another angle. The others spread along the slope, using brush and lingering dust to circle behind. Ethan Brooks watched the enormous creature continually reposition itself. Whenever a gray shape appeared on the left edge, it threw a stone into the bushes there, forcing the wolf back toward the narrow approach. The calculated behavior showed Ethan that Bigfoot was keeping the entire pack in sight and preventing it from dividing and reaching Jacob from several directions. Jacob remained against the fallen trunk, with the safety line around his ankle, making it difficult to stand. Ethan knelt and used the multi-tool to cut the synthetic fibers. The blade slipped over the thick surface and made only a small tear. Bigfoot turned at the scrape of metal against the clasp and came closer, causing Ethan to put a hand on his gun. The creature stopped several steps from Jacob and looked from Ethan's hand to the trapped strap. After a moment, Ethan removed his hand from the grip and moved aside. Bigfoot bent down and pulled the metal clasp with 2 fingers. The first effort failed. It changed the angle, held the strap against the root, and bent the connector at its weakest point. The clasp snapped, and the line fell from Jacob's leg. Jacob pulled his foot back, rubbed his ankle, and looked at the creature with gratitude and amazement. Bigfoot did not wait for a response. It returned to the approach, raised the branch, and watched the wolves. Ethan helped Jacob deeper into the rock hollow, where the ground was higher and protected by 2 basalt boulders. From the opposite slope, 3 loud knocks suddenly sounded. Bigfoot raised its head and answered with 2 deep blows against the nearest tree. The entire wolf pack turned toward the sound, ears erect, and its formation broke for several seconds. Ethan watched the gap in the canopy for another shape, but only drifting dust answered. The distraction exposed how narrow the margin was between shelter and encirclement. Jacob picked up a stone, although his fingers trembled. Ethan checked the spray and found enough liquid for only one use. The scar-faced leader recognized the weakness first. It gathered speed over the stones and charged straight up the narrow route. Bigfoot lowered its shoulder, tightened its grip on the branch, and placed itself between the wolf and Jacob. The lead wolf rushed up the rocky passage, scattering gravel beneath its claws. Bigfoot swung the branch across its body and struck the ground in front of the animal's muzzle. The wolf changed direction, slid toward the edge, and leaped back while 2 others used the opening to approach from both sides. Bigfoot pushed a stone with its foot, sending it rolling down the corridor and splitting the pack into 2 groups. The response showed that it controlled the terrain rather than acting in anger. Ethan pulled Jacob deeper into the hollow, but scratching behind him made him turn. A young wolf had found a root around the brush, head lowered and eyes fixed on Jacob. Ethan stepped in front of the worker, raised the bear spray, and fired when the wolf came within a few meters. The cloud struck its face and forced it away, but swirling wind immediately blew some of the chemical back. Ethan and Jacob coughed violently, their eyes burning and vision blurring. Bigfoot heard them and turned. The momentary distraction allowed the leader to rush again and bite into the creature's left forearm. Bigfoot roared and dropped the branch, but it used its other arm to throw the wolf into the ferns, rather than smash it against the rocks. Dark blood soaked through the fur and ran in thin lines down its wrist. Ethan saw the thick skin beneath and realized his body camera was recording the clearest biological evidence he had ever witnessed. Yet the urgency forced him to forget hair samples or blood because 3 more wolves were closing in. Jacob leaned against the wall, able to stand on only 1 leg. He looked at Bigfoot defending him and told Ethan that the creature could run away. The northern forest was open, and its strength was sufficient to escape the pack. But whenever a wolf moved toward Jacob, Bigfoot shifted its body to cover the gap. Ethan saw it too. The creature had carried Jacob away from the landslide, freed the safety line, and now stayed despite its injury. The leader rose from the ferns, shook its head, and returned to the front of the pack. Bigfoot picked up the branch, but the bitten hand could no longer hold it firmly. Ethan checked the spray and found the can nearly empty, while the handgun was dangerous because every target stood too close to the others. He turned into the hollow and found a partly burned branch in old ashes. Ethan wrapped dry grass around its end, lit it with his emergency lighter, and stepped back into the open. The flame shook in the wind and illuminated his face. Bigfoot glanced at him warily as Ethan took a position beside it. No words passed between them, but both faced the wolves preparing to charge. Jacob picked up 2 stones and held them tightly. Ethan's body camera continued recording the moment when a ranger and the creature he had pursued now stood on the same side to protect one man's life. Ethan Brooks stood to Bigfoot's left, holding the smoldering branch with both hands, while orange firelight swept across the dust covering the outcrop. The creature glanced at him, watched the flame, and then returned its attention to the wolves, tightening their circle. Ethan avoided looking directly into its face and kept his body angled so the burning branch stood between them as a signal that he wanted to oppose the common danger. Bigfoot moved right, allowing Ethan to hold the narrow passage while it guarded the wider slope where 3 wolves were trying to spread out. The cooperation formed within seconds, without speech or gestures. When the leader advanced, Ethan lowered the flame near the ground, and smoke slowed the animal. Bigfoot struck its larger branch against the rock wall, producing a dry explosion that made 2 wolves behind it retreat. From the hollow, Jacob threw stones onto the ground in front of the pack. His injured shoulder weakened the throws, but the noise disrupted their rhythm. 1 wolf moved along the left edge. Bigfoot saw it before Ethan stepped sideways and swept the branch down across its path. The animal turned, and Ethan moved the flame into the resulting gap. For that moment, all 3 formed an effective defensive line. Bigfoot used strength to preserve space, Ethan used fire, and Jacob made noise from behind. Gradually, they learned one another's rhythm. The wolves tried to close in twice more and were driven back each time before reaching the hollow. The giant creature threw stones, struck branches, and gave deep warning growls. Only when 1 wolf slipped close to Jacob's feet did it swing an arm, throw the animal into the ferns, and return to its place. Ethan saw the restraint and understood that Bigfoot was protecting them while still trying to avoid turning the confrontation into killing. The bite on its forearm continued bleeding, and the hand holding the branch trembled. Its left leg also began to buckle after each turn. Ethan wanted to approach and examine it, but the wolves still waited around the outcrop for a clearer opening. The flame on Ethan's branch shrank, eating into wet wood and burning only around the bundle of grass. He searched his coat with 1 hand, but the emergency lighter was almost empty. Behind him, Jacob reported that he had only a few stones left. Just as their defense weakened, the sound of helicopter blades came from the west. It grew louder above the treetops, causing the wolves to raise their heads and move chaotically. Ethan briefly believed the rescuers had found them, but the leader suddenly turned away from the sound, circled Bigfoot, and lunged directly at Jacob. The lead wolf passed around Bigfoot's right side and leaped toward Jacob Miller, while the helicopter threw the outcrop into confusion. Jacob turned to avoid it, but his injured ankle shifted his weight to one side. His boot slipped on wet gravel, his arms reached into empty air, and his body fell toward the edge of the rock hollow. Ethan Brooks lunged, dropped to his knees, and caught Jacob's wrist just as his feet left the ground. Jacob's lower body hung over the cliff, and the safety line caught on a rotten root behind him and pulled tight. Ethan lay flat, gripping a crack with 1 hand, and Jacob with the other, while the soil beneath his chest began breaking away. Jacob tried to find footing, but the rock below was steep and slick. Every movement pulled the root farther out of the ground. Bigfoot heard the falling stones, turned from the pack, and moved toward them. The lead wolf followed and bit into the creature's left calf. The attack made Bigfoot stumble, but it bent, seized the safety line behind Jacob's back, and pulled upward. Ethan felt as though his arm would tear from its socket, yet he held Jacob's wrist until the man's chest slid over the edge. Bigfoot continued pulling and brought both Jacob and Ethan onto solid ground. Only when they lay safely behind the fallen trunk did it turn, sweep the wolf away from its leg, and force it back down the rocky corridor. Blood soaked the fur around its calf. Bigfoot braced a hand against the trunk, its knee buckling for several seconds before it forced itself upright. Ethan crawled to Jacob, checked his breathing, and the shoulder that had struck the rock. Jacob remained conscious, but his face was white, and his hand gripped Ethan's arm as though he could not believe he had been pulled from the cliff. He looked at the injured creature and said hoarsely that it could have released the rope to save itself. Ethan understood. Bigfoot had accepted another injury because it chose to keep both humans on the outcrop. Above the trees, the rescue helicopter appeared through the dust and circled while searching for a place to lower a line. Rotor wash battered the branches and lifted gravel and ash, forcing the pilot higher. Ethan raised both arms, but the opening was too narrow, and the swirling air pushed the rescue cable hard toward the rock wall. The helicopter had to leave the outcrop to seek another approach. As the sound faded, Ethan looked down and saw a new crack running across the place where they had just been lying. It continued widening all the way to the feet of the wounded Bigfoot. The crack beneath Bigfoot widened, carrying gravel over the edge. Ethan Brooks understood that the refuge was losing stability. The helicopter noise had faded, and landslide dust still swirled among the firs, hiding the rescuers. He moved to the northern side of the outcrop, where a rocky channel descended toward lower ground. It was only wide enough for one person at a time, but the stone there was harder and might connect with the western ridge. Ethan pointed in that direction and gestured for Jacob Miller and the creature to leave. Jacob used Ethan's shoulder to stand. His injured ankle made each step uneven, while Bigfoot used a branch as a cane because blood continued seeping from the bite on its calf. The creature studied the descent, then placed a hand on the ground. It changed direction and pulled Jacob away from a flat strip covered in moss. Ethan was still wondering why when the surface collapsed, revealing a hollow carved by groundwater. The details strengthened his belief that Bigfoot sensed ground movement more effectively than any equipment they possessed. Ethan went first and tested every foothold. Jacob followed, and the creature remained last, watching the wolves hidden in the brush. Whenever Jacob swayed, Bigfoot extended its uninjured arm to support his back and then withdrew, allowing him to continue under his own strength. Jacob suggested that Ethan go ahead, find the rescuers, and return with them. Ethan refused, saying that separating now would make all three more vulnerable. The decision marked a change in him. The ranger, who had chased the creature to rescue Jacob, now deliberately adjusted his pace so the injured creature could keep up. Behind them, a large section of the outcrop broke from the crack and fell into the valley. The wolves answered with short howls from several directions, showing that the encirclement was moving with them. At a narrower part of the channel, Ethan found a large print in the mud beside the wall. It was fresh, with sharp edges, but smaller than the prints of the Bigfoot traveling with them. Another line of tracks ran parallel to the path, sometimes close and sometimes disappearing behind roots, showing that a second creature had followed from nearby. Before Ethan could warn Jacob, heavy footsteps sounded ahead. The wounded Bigfoot immediately moved past both men and placed itself between them and the violently shaking trees. The trees ahead parted, revealing a second creature descending into the rocky channel. It was shorter than the wounded Bigfoot and covered in close brown-gray fur over a leaner frame, but it still towered above Ethan Brooks and Jacob Miller. The first creature lowered its shoulders and moved sideways to keep both men behind it. Ethan understood that the creatures recognized each other, although he could not predict what would follow. The newcomer stopped 10 meters away, looked over the blood on its companion's forearm and calf, and released a low hiss. It moved one step closer, but when it noticed Ethan's hand near his gun, it immediately picked up a large stone. Jacob called Ethan's name and told him to put the weapon away. Ethan looked at the wounded Bigfoot, remembered it carrying Jacob from the landslide, holding him at the cliff and guarding him from the wolves, and removed his hand from the grip. He unholstered the handgun, placed it on the rock, and stepped back. The second creature watched, held the stone for several seconds, and then lowered its arm. It approached its companion, touched a hand to its shoulder, and examined the wounds. The injured Bigfoot made a sequence of throat sounds, interrupted by blows against its chest. The other answered in the same way, and both turned toward the west, where landslide dust obscured the ridge. Ethan noticed a loose piece of orange marking ribbon tied around the second creature's arm. It was identical to the ribbon removed from the marked trees at the logging site and transferred to the emergency road. That detail dissolved his remaining doubts. These creatures had moved the markers, opened the fence, and tried to direct the workers away from danger before the mountain collapsed. The second Bigfoot went to the edge of the channel, pushed the ferns aside, and pointed toward a hidden path between two rock walls. It led toward the western ridge where the rescue team was approaching. Ethan still hesitated, wondering whether it might instead lead farther into their territory. The wolves howled closer, and the wounded creature turned, leaning its weight on the branch. The second Bigfoot struck a tree 3 times. 2 other sequences answered from deep in the forest, heavy and separated by several seconds. Ethan looked at Jacob and then at the moving shadows around the channel. They had discovered that the first creature had never been alone, and that an entire group had been silently watching their every step from the forest. The second Bigfoot moved toward the trail and signaled for Ethan Brooks and Jacob Miller to follow, while the wounded creature remained at the intersection of the channel and slope in the fading evening light. Ethan looked at the blood running down its calf and understood. The first creature intended to stay behind and hold off the wolves long enough for its companion to lead the humans away. Jacob understood as well. He leaned on Ethan's shoulder and said hoarsely that they could not abandon the creature that had saved him so many times. Ethan looked toward the path that might reach the rescuers and then toward the howls, drawing closer. The spray was almost empty, the fire had gone out, and the injured Bigfoot could barely run. Ethan found his final signal flare, the kind used to mark a position in bad weather. He pulled the safety cap and held it while signaling Jacob to retreat toward the trail. The second Bigfoot stepped in front of Ethan and pressed a huge hand downward, trying to force him to leave. Ethan touched his own chest, pointed to the wounded creature, and then to Jacob. The awkward gesture carried a simple meaning. The creature had saved them, and now they would help it. The second Bigfoot watched him and lowered its hand. Gray shapes appeared behind the ferns. The scar-faced leader came first, with 5 others spreading to both sides. The wounded Bigfoot planted its branch and positioned itself between the pack and the escape route. Ethan activated the flare. Red light burst out with a sharp hiss, staining the rock channel brightly through the dust. He threw it onto the ground before the wolves. Thick smoke poured across the narrow passage, startling the animals and forcing them apart. The second Bigfoot rushed forward, put an arm around its companion, and pulled it toward the trail. Jacob and Ethan followed, each helping from one side as they crossed loose rocks. For several dozen seconds, the plan worked exactly as Ethan hoped. The flare held the wolves back. Both creatures had left the defensive position, and the route to the ridge was only a short distance away. Then the ground trembled again. A sharp crack came from the rock wall on the right, followed by soil and stone falling between the group. Ethan grabbed Jacob and threw both of them aside, while the 2 Bigfoots were pushed in the opposite direction. Dust filled the channel and cut off all vision. When the sound subsided, a new wall of rock stood before Ethan, higher than a person and extending between the 2 cliffs. Jacob shouted toward the other side, his voice echoing through the cold cracks. Several seconds later, a single knock answered, weak but clear. Ethan pressed his hand to the rock and waited for another signal. The forest fell silent, while the wolves began howling behind them. The new wall sealed the mountain channel, forcing Ethan Brooks and Jacob Miller back from the falling dust. The wolves howled closer behind them, while only narrow gaps remained between the overlapping rocks ahead. Ethan knelt, checked the base of the slide with the light on his body camera, and found an old water channel running beneath the rubble. The space was so low an adult could only crawl, but it was their only remaining route. Jacob leaned against the wall, unable to balance well on his swollen ankle. Ethan told him to sit, removed the remaining safety straps, and crawled in first to test the passage. The body camera showed 15% battery. He studied the indicator for several seconds and considered switching it off, then allowed it to keep recording. If they failed to escape the channel, the footage might be the only explanation of what had happened. Ethan used the multi-tool to pry away small stones and push mud and rotten roots aside. Every movement made gravel fall onto his shoulders and reminded him the tunnel could collapse at any time. After several meters, he heard a weak knock from the other side. Ethan stopped and struck the rock 3 times with the knife handle. 3 knocks answered, closer and clearer. He called for Jacob to follow. Jacob crawled with his healthy leg and dragged the injured one. At the narrowest section, his shoulders wedged between 2 rocks, and his breathing immediately became rapid. Ethan turned around in the cramped space, caught Jacob's wrist, and told him to remove his jacket, angle his shoulders, and push slowly. Howls outside the channel made Jacob struggle faster, shifting the stones overhead. Ethan ordered him to remain calm, watch Ethan's hand, and follow each movement. As Jacob freed his shoulder, a large rock slid down from above. Ethan raised an arm instinctively, but the weight was far beyond his strength. At that moment, a gigantic hand appeared from the other side and held the rock above them. Through the darkness, Ethan recognized the wounded Bigfoot, kneeling on one leg, its arm trembling from exhaustion while it kept the opening clear. Ethan pulled Jacob through quickly. Only when both men were out did the creature slowly lower the rock and brace itself against the wall to remain standing. Blood from its calf soaked the mud and left a long trail behind it. The second Bigfoot appeared from the western trees, its brown-gray fur coated in dust and a large branch in its hand. It had circled the rockfall, drawn the wolves away from the narrow opening, and returned just as Ethan Brooks and Jacob Miller crawled out. The wounded creature still knelt beside the wall, breathing rapidly and gripping the stone it had held above the men. Howling behind them made all 3 turn. The scar-faced leader appeared first, and 5 others spread into an arc around the open forest. Ethan understood this would be the pack's final attempt. He raised the bear spray, checked what little remained, and stood in front of Jacob. Jacob picked up 2 stones and leaned against a tree because of his swollen ankle. The second Bigfoot moved beside its companion, lifted the wounded arm over its shoulder, and faced the wolves with it. All 4 formed a defensive line. The leader advanced, testing the scent of blood from the wounded Bigfoot's calf. Ethan waited until it came close enough and fired. The chemical stream swept across the ground, making the animal jerk its head and retreat. 2 behind it immediately tried to circle toward Jacob. He struck the stones together in a sharp, rapid rhythm, drawing their attention. The second Bigfoot lifted its branch and threw it hard onto the ground before the pack. The heavy wood struck stone, scattered gravel, and forced the wolves apart. The injured Bigfoot shifted its weight to the healthy leg, raised its head, and gave the longest roar Ethan had ever heard. The sound traveled across the valley and lingered in the ancient forest. Immediately, deep knocks answered from 3 directions. The first came from the ridge, the second from across the creek, and the last sequence from the southern forest. The wolves stopped. Their ears stood high, and their heads turned toward the signals surrounding them. The leader held its position for several seconds, then backed away slowly. When it turned, the others withdrew one by one and vanished into the ferns. The 2 Bigfoots remained still until every footstep had faded. The wounded creature collapsed, its arm slipping from its companion's shoulder. Ethan stepped forward to examine the bites, but the second Bigfoot immediately stood over it and watched him warily. Ethan stopped, placed the spray on the ground, and moved back to show respect. Calls from the rescue team came through the trees on the western ridge. The second Bigfoot turned and tensed. Ethan looked toward Linda approaching, and then toward the two creatures that had saved Jacob. He understood that the next few seconds would determine whether the encounter ended peacefully or with a gunshot in the forest. The rescue team's voices came closer through the firs, accompanied by breaking branches and short commands. Ethan Brooks immediately moved into the open and raised both hands to block their advance. Linda Carver appeared first, followed by two rifle-carrying rangers and a rescuer with a medical bag. When the younger ranger saw the two enormous creatures beside Jacob Miller, he raised his weapon instinctively. Ethan spun and shouted for him to lower it, stating clearly that Jacob was alive because of them. Jacob braced himself against a tree, forced himself upright on his swollen ankle, and stood beside Ethan. He explained that the wounded creature had carried him away from the logging site before the mountain collapsed and then protected him from the wolf pack. Linda looked at the mud on Jacob's clothing, the blood around Bigfoot's calf, and signaled everyone to remain still. The second Bigfoot stood partly in front of its companion, supporting its shoulder with one hand and holding the other arm outward as though ready to shield it. For several seconds the forest was so quiet that Ethan could hear the wounded creature breathing and the metal on Jacob's safety harness trembling. The final light of day angled through the canopy and illuminated Bigfoot's face. Ethan saw amber-brown eyes, a broad nose, dark skin around the mouth, and water droplets on black and brown fur. The face showed exhaustion, caution, and awareness, nothing like the mindless ferocity created by old stories in his imagination. Ethan's body camera still operated, its indicator blinking as the creature looked directly at him. Ethan stepped aside and opened a route toward the northern trees. The second Bigfoot understood and slowly helped its companion turn away. Before leaving the clearing, the wounded creature stopped, placed one hand on the nearest fir, and knocked 3 slow times. Jacob picked up the metal clasp from his safety line and answered with 3 knocks. Bigfoot held his gaze for another moment and then turned away, fading between the trees. The 2 rangers started to follow, but Linda raised a hand and stopped them. Ethan lowered his arms and did not feel relief until the heavy footsteps were far away. He looked at the base of the tree and saw a tuft of black hair caught on the damaged bark. Ethan bent and reached for the evidence, but a strong gust from the valley tore it free. It spun over the rock edge and disappeared into cloudy water before he could touch it. Jacob Miller was taken to a hospital in Gold Beach with a sprained ankle, dehydration, and extensive bruising along his shoulder, back, and arms. Doctors noted that the injuries were consistent with being carried over steep terrain and compressed by a safety harness, while his skin showed no bites, scratches, or wounds, suggesting the creature had attempted to attack him. Ethan Brooks remained at the ranger station to surrender the body camera. The device held more than 2 hours of continuous footage. Much of it was violently shaken and chaotic, but several segments clearly showed the creature walking on 2 legs, supporting Jacob's head while crossing the stream, breaking the harness clasp, standing against the wolves, and looking toward the camera before leaving. Authorities retained the original for examination and instructed Ethan to limit public statements. Several weeks later, a copy appeared online and spread far beyond expectations. Bigfoot believers called it the most convincing evidence ever recorded in Oregon, while many skeptics claimed the creature was a person in a costume. The landslide had been used to stage the story, and the wolf scenes had been altered. The argument became increasingly bitter. One visual effects specialist analyzed the shoulder movement, arm length, and the way the creature carried Jacob, concluding that the body structure would be difficult to reproduce with a conventional suit. Another emphasized that low-resolution, heavy dust, and constant motion made every conclusion unreliable. Data examination showed that the footage had been recorded continuously on the day of the slide, that the time and coordinates matched the rescue report, and that no obvious editing had been detected. Even so, the unbroken nature of the recording could not determine what species the creature belonged to. The logging company denied intentionally ignoring geological danger, but Dale Hargrove was suspended for continuing machinery operations after Ethan's warnings. A geological report confirmed that ground accumulation, weakened soil, and vibration from heavy equipment could have contributed to triggering the slope failure. Ethan rejected most interview invitations because he felt that the experience of saving Jacob was being turned into entertainment. Jacob's position was simpler than every analysis. He said the creature had removed him from a place that certainly would have buried him and had remained to protect him until rescuers arrived. When Ethan reviewed a high-resolution copy, he noticed that in one frame behind the wounded Bigfoot, there appeared to be two more large shapes between the trees. One held a strip of orange marking ribbon. Ethan had not seen that detail at the site, and it made the question of how many creatures had silently observed the rescue even harder to dismiss. 6 months after the landslide at Blackfern Ridge, the logging site remained closed behind geological warning signs. The collapsed mountainside had become a field of gray earth, where broken trunks lay piled together. Remnants of the afternoon, no member of the crew wanted to discuss for long. Jacob Miller did not return to his old job. He began maintaining equipment for a small company near Gold Beach and participated in safety briefings for new workers. Whenever he spoke about Blackfern Ridge, Jacob focused on the warning signs that had been ignored: water seeping from the mountain, cracked soil around roots, falling stones, and strange changes in the forest. He rarely described the creature that carried him away in detail, but always emphasized that surviving had taught him that human confidence could be the most dangerous thing in the wilderness. Ethan Brooks continued, working as a ranger. The event did not turn him into someone who automatically believed every Bigfoot report, nor did he try to persuade colleagues that every large footprint belonged to an unrecognized creature. What changed was the way he listened. Reports once dismissed as rumors were now recorded more carefully, including time, wind direction, terrain, sounds, and nearby animal behavior. One early spring morning, Linda Carver and Ethan returned to Blackfern Ridge to recover a motion camera lost after the slide. They found it beneath a fallen tree. The case was scratched, but the memory still worked. Most of the data showed only rain, moving branches, and darkness. However, an audio recording made at 2:17 a.m. left both of them sitting silently in the vehicle. 3 knocks sounded near the camera, followed by 3 more answering from a distant slope, and then a long, low hiss in the quiet forest. Ethan offered no conclusion. He simply saved a copy and wrote the exact coordinates in his notebook. Before leaving, he walked to the outcrop where Jacob had been rescued. 3 new depressions marked a fur near the edge, higher than Ethan could reach. He took a roll of orange marking ribbon from his pocket and placed it at the base of the tree as a belated acknowledgement that the earlier message had finally been understood. When he turned away, a deep knock sounded from the forest. Ethan stopped, placed his hand on the nearest tree, and struck 3 slow beats. The same sequence answered from somewhere he could not see. On the way back to the vehicle, he discovered that the roll of ribbon had disappeared. 3 short strips were now tied to branches ahead, forming a route away from the landslide zone. Ethan studied the markers for several seconds and followed the direction back toward the station. The forest had shown him enough, and this time he understood the warning before it was too late.